Thank you very much for joining us for this very first decolonization workshop at BU's Pardee School of Global Studies. I'm your host and moderator. My name is Joy Sarkar. I'm an assistant professor here at BU's Pardee School of Global Studies and also the director of the Global Decolonization Initiative that is organizing this event. I'm sorry about the noise. I'm still admitting attendance, and we have a large group of participants, which is really, really exciting for a Monday morning, you can imagine. So this event was made possible because of the support of the Pardee School at BU at Boston University, the Center for the Study of Asia, the African Studies Center, and the Institute for Culture, Religion, and World Affairs. This event is also co-sponsored by Society for Advancing the History of South Asia. And in fact, we are grateful to have on the panel, the president of the society, Professor Michelle Loro. I'm grateful to her for co-sponsoring this talk and the other talks that are coming up later this month. And I'll share a link in the chat later on during this event. Something to keep in mind is that this session is being recorded. So if you do not wish to be recorded, please mute your audio and your video. I think we have enough of a quorum to get started. Okay, great. We have a powerful panel here with the 4 editors of this really influential volume, League Against Imperialism, Lives and Afterlives, that was published earlier this year by Leiden University Press. We have with us Professor Caroline Scholter from Leiden University, Professor Michelle Loro from Salem State, Professor Heather Street-Salter from Northeastern here in Boston, and Dr. Sana Tanuri Karam from Forum Transregionale Studien Berlin. And joining us from the University of Bristol is Professor Sulin Lewis, who very, very kindly agreed to act as the discussant of this 400+ page volume. So I extend a very warm welcome to all our panelists who are joining from a variety of time zones, and also welcome to all of you who are joining us on a Monday morning if you're on the East Coast. I see the participants are cutting across time zones and, more importantly, historiographies. I am thrilled to see people from Schaefer, from AHA, from NACBS, from AAS, and all the various acronyms that define us. It only speaks volumes for this book that what a terrific volume this is about the challenges and opportunities of anti-imperial solidarity in the interwar years and beyond. So I'm not going to speak any longer. I'll just explain quickly the format, and that is our 4 editors have agreed to speak for 5 minutes each, giving introductory remarks. And that will be followed by our discussant, Professor Lewis, who will speak to us for about 20 minutes. So we have 20 and 20, 80 minutes. That still gives us a little under an hour for the Q&A. So with that, I turn it over to our 4 editors, Caroline, Michelle, Heather, and Sana. And after their remarks, we'll hear from Sulin. Over to you guys.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Sarkar, for this opportunity. And thank you so much, Professor Lewis, for agreeing to comment on this, for everyone for being here. You cannot imagine how hard it is to get a book out during a pandemic and not to be able to launch this together, physically together, that is, and to be present in the same rooms to do this. At the same time, this is definitely a privilege. To be able to sit on the screen and be able to see all of you from all across the world and to talk about our volume. So we are very, very grateful that you are here. All right, so about the book, I'm going to start by introducing a little bit the League itself, and then to tell you a little bit about the book as in form of an introduction before my other co-editors take over. So the League Against Imperialism was an international organization founded in 1927 at a Congress held in Brussels, where 174 delegates representing 31 states, colonies, or regions, and 134 organizations came together. For 5 days, these individuals participated in meetings and discussions, they exchanged ideas, and they planned for the future. Those present were joined by a desire to expose the brutalities of colonial rule, to support the liberation of colonies around the world, and to build solidarity between workers in imperialist countries and the oppressed in the colonies. Over the next 10 years after this Congress meeting in 1927, during the League's existence from 1927 to 1937, different secretariats were established locally all across the world. Campaigns, demonstrations, declarations, different relationships and exchanges happened across the colonized and colonizing world through this network, through this web that is the League. We share the belief of the League's original participants that its creation did indeed mark a significant historical moment. However, briefly, the League was one of the largest, most inclusive international groups of its kind. Its leadership and membership included representatives of former colonies as well as the semi-colonial world, and Europeans and Americans from colonial as well as non-colonial powers. As editors of this volume, we believe the League should be studied in its own right for its successes in bringing together so many leftists and anti-colonial activists from so many parts of the world, and also for its initial ambitions to cross racial, cultural, and ideological boundaries to achieve its larger goals. Hello, can you hear me again? Okay, perfect. So in spite of its many high-profile participants and the global reach, the membership of the League remains relatively obscure and poorly understood in historical scholarship, with the exception of brief mentions of the League in various historiographies of internationalism and socialism, and one volume on book actually on this topic by Frederick Peterson. And often these accounts we found have produced and replicated inaccuracies about the members or the general narrative of the League. So as historians, we realize that in order to write a history of the League, we need to contend with linguistic diversity and archival breadth and dispersion across the geographical landscape. And therefore, we realize that this history could not be written by a single historian, but rather by facilitating a dialogue between researchers specializing in different aspects of the anti-imperialist movement, particularly those with expertise in the formerly colonized world. By doing so, we created a space for a global and transnational framework that moves beyond the categories of colony, nation, and empire to comprehend more fully the transnational nature of the 20th century world. So there are various historiographical interventions that we make in this volume, and I will not speak about all of them as my co-editors will do so. But I really would like to talk about the way that this volume actually has rethought certain categories within the interwar period. Now, the volume places the League as a product of the interwar period by highlighting the significance of that period, and especially of a post-World War I world, and how World War I actually shapes anti-colonial discourse in the various colonies, but also provides the availability of space in the metropole for anti-colonial activism during that period. So a lot of the contributions in the volume show continuity between the pre and post-war periods. So they show how anti-colonialism did not just emerge after World War I and in the interwar period, but also had certain legacies and a longer history in the pre-World War I period. But the volume also highlights how World War I shapes anti-colonial and nationalist movements in the colonized world, and how the interwar world, including, of course, the role of the Comintern, which we will talk a little bit about more today, provided that, that opportunity as well. So it was really the interwar period's fluidity and flexibility in ideologies and allegiances that allowed for this plethora of actors and their political adherences to converge in a place like the League. On the other hand, we also argue that the League itself was significant in the shaping of the interwar world, informing anti-colonial nationalism, communism, socialism, and pacifism in ways we have failed to see because of the contentious and all too brief history of the League's existence. I would like to turn over now the talk to Professor Heather Street-Salter.
Thank you, Sana. And I echo Sana when I say thank you for having us to talk about this book. And also thank you all for being here. What a very strange year. So the book itself has a lot of variety to offer. We have 15 chapters. If you haven't seen it yet, we have 15 chapters in the book, plus an introduction that sets up the whole thing in terms of our interventions and a little bit about the League in general. We have a foreword from Erez Manella and an afterword from Antoinette Burton. The chapters themselves deal with Latin America, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Levant, China, Europe, India, and Indonesia, or the Dutch East Indies at the time. They deal with a variety of well-known and lesser-known activists, and they also explore internationalism, international communism, Black internationalism, and Afro-Asian solidarities. Now, Michelle and Caroline are going to talk a little bit about the two major themes of the book by addressing lives and afterlives. That's the subtitle of the volume. But I want to spend just a few minutes laying out a few of the main debates and interventions of the book. And there's just four that I'm going to mention. That's not all there are, but there's just four that I'm going to talk about in my 5 minutes. So the first has to do with the extent to which we should regard the League Against Imperialism as a communist organization, as well as the extent to which we should highlight the participation of the Comintern in it. Authors in the book actually don't agree on this, though we as editors argue that even while the League was closely linked to international communism, especially in the early 1930s, it also engaged with and overlapped with many non-communist movements around the world, even during the early 1930s. So part of the issue has to do with the sources we use to tell the story of the League. Someone using Comintern sources, for example, is likely to overemphasize the importance of communists in the Comintern and the organization, while someone using sources from India, for example, or from Britain after 1933 might tell a different story with different emphases. So that's the first major intervention. The second has to do with an argument we're making about the very strong connections between the forces of nationalism and internationalism in the interwar period. In fact, we think that the essays together demonstrate the importance of situating nationalism and internationalism within the same analytic frame of interwar anti-imperialism. So in doing this, we want to push beyond the categories of colony and nation and empire so that we can better understand, as Sana said, the transnational nature of the 20th century world. So related to this, and the third point that I want to make is that we think these stories show how anti-imperialist internationalism shaped the local histories of anti-colonial resistance around the world. So what I mean is, not only did local individuals come together to make up this international organization, but the participation of individuals in this organization also ended up influencing the trajectories of anti-colonial movements in their home regions as well. And then fourth, and finally, while we think that the afterlives of the League were important in many ways, we also think it's important to understand the League on its own terms and in the context of the interwar world, rather than as a precursor to something else. So there were afterlives, and Caroline is going to be talking about them in a moment, but these were complex and varied and international rather than prescribed to a single moment, such as Bandung, which is actually what the League is often seen as a precursor for. So we realized that the book cannot be perfect. We sought essays for geographical regions that we ultimately couldn't get essays for example. We also know that much more needs to be done about gender in the membership and activities and perspectives of the people that were involved in the League. But at the same time, we're pleased that the volume represents a strong majority of the scholars and the scholarship that is currently being conducted about the League. We also, because of the time that we all took to workshop the chapters long in advance of the time that essays were submitted, we're also pleased with the ways that the essays speak to one another. So, of course, the essays each tell their own fascinating story about a different place or a different person or a different time. But by working together to understand the much larger global story of the League, we also feel like the essays together tell a story that is really more than the sum of its individual parts. And so Michelle is now going to be talking about the first major theme of the book, which is the lives.
Thanks, Heather. And I just want to echo what everyone else has said. Thanks to Dr. Sarkar and the Global Decolonization at 60 project. I'm thrilled to be here talking about our book and sort of launching what's going to be an exciting couple of weeks of events. So that's fantastic. And I also would be remiss without thanking also somebody in the audience. Susan Pennybacker, I know, is here. Her, as well as Ani Mukherjee, joined us as we were thinking through this project. We invited them to sort of give us comments. And so when Heather talks about how this book comes together as a cohesive whole, it's thanks in many ways to Susan, to Ani Mukherjee, to Arizmela and Antoinette Burton, who gave us critical feedback early on. So I did want to note that. We took apart sort of the book, and in many ways, Heather and Sana talked about the League Against Imperialism and the project that we put together here. And I'm going to talk about the lives, and Caroline will talk about the afterlives. And so it's one of the central arguments in this book that the lives of the League Against Imperialism were essential building blocks of global anti-imperialist networks of the interwar world. And many of the essays in this volume take one of the lives of many lives in order to shed light on some of these global narratives and global histories. And I realized when we were preparing today that we didn't have any images to put up and share on our screen. And in some ways that's okay for Zoom. It can be a little tedious, but this particular volume is full of fantastic images of the many lives that came to participate in the League Against Imperialism, both in Brussels, as well as in the various other meetings and networks that the League facilitated and coordinated. So this is just one of many images to give it sort of a plug. Informal images, portraits from the 1920s, which, you know, inevitably no one's really looking at the camera and all of their eyes are closed, but images nonetheless. So even though this book is about the League Against Imperialism, it decenters the institutional history in some ways, as well as party histories, organizational histories, and instead stresses the importance of individuals. As Christopher Lee's chapter and contribution on South Africa and Alex Laguma suggests, the volume approaches the complexity of this rich history of anti-imperialism by emphasizing the usefulness of biography for approaching broader global trends. So I thought that was a really good quote. I'm glad Chris is actually here. So of the essays in this volume, many underscore the significance of key figures who participated in the League, some well-known like Jawaharlal Nehru, V.K. Krishna Menon of India, Muhammad Hatta of Indonesia, Lamin Senghor, Nashali Haj, and Willy Munzenberg. Other essays tackle less well-known figures, and you're going to actually find that you'll learn quite a bit about people that you didn't know about. For example, Anna Belogorova and Sana Tenoria Karam explore the lives of lesser-known activists in China and the Levant, respectively. But taken together, and I think that's what's really important about this volume, is that it really does come together. Taken together, their archival and biographical narratives weave together a story of a robust and vibrant anti-imperialist movement that worked within the colonial world, as well as a broad constellation of what we might consider international communism. And I think that this volume also sort of uses these lives to break apart what we mean by international communism and demonstrate its fluidity and flexibility in the interwar moment. But from this, we can see several critical points that emerge, I think, from this volume. I'm going to mention three. So first, personal connections and pedagogical experiences mattered to the broader global movements of the interwar period. The traveling of information and ideas depended on a tangled web of contacts that were facilitated and coordinated by the League's major conferences, their ephemera, and their correspondence networks. These were spaces, all of them collectively, where individuals witnessed and learned about colonial oppression in vastly diverse and distant sites. as well as narrated their own stories of anti-colonial struggle. So the volume demonstrates the power of their experiences and their contacts, and both the witnessing and narrating of these struggles, of shared struggles, of relationship building, and of pedagogical opportunities through transnational engagement. And I would just want to say that these contacts extended far beyond the institutional confines of the League Against Imperialism itself. While many people met within the League and through these various sites that the League coordinated, their involvement, as Donald Hassett argues in his contribution on Algeria, their involvement provided them with the language, the practices, and the contact, which they could use to develop their own networks of anti-imperialist solidarity, sometimes within the orbit of the League Against Imperialism and sometimes entirely outside of it. So I think that that's really critical in thinking about the sort of wider impact that the League had in fostering and coordinating connections that extend within the League and beyond it. Secondly, many of the essays that focus on lives within our volume unsettle misconceptions and myths that have become part of the historiography of both the League Against Imperialism and the individuals, as well as the nations that they come from or colonies that they come from. So for example, one of the most common misconceptions that the League book can clear up is the fact that Ho Chi Minh was never at the Brussels Congress. Wasn't even in Europe at the time, yet that had sort of been printed over and over again and sort of become part of this myth of the League in this moment where everybody who was who became a statesman in Asia was at the League Against Imperialism. So simply using empirical evidence to talk about what actually happened in the League is critical, and a critical intervention of its own. Secondly, I think that there are some really other important interventions that can be mentioned. Klaas Tuch's essay on Mohammed Hatta is really critical in thinking about the Indonesian delegation at the Brussels Congress. In it, he argues that Mohammed Hatta was actually a minor and marginal figure in the interwar world, and that the League Against Imperialism really amplified his status. He was in many ways, he eventually becomes the vice president of Indonesia, but in the 1920s and in 1927 in particular, he was involved in a student organization in the Netherlands that really did not speak for Indonesian nationalism or represent in many ways a large number of people in Indonesia. And so setting the record straight in terms of the myths that are created by about some of the lives and the nationalist movements they represented is really, really critical. And other myths about, for example, the death of Lamine Senghor in France, who he's a Black internationalist and was very famous for being with at the Brussels Congress. Many people have sort of attributed his death in a prison to his involvement with the League Against Imperialism. And so David Murphy's essay sets some of the record straight on his life and his contributions to the anti-imperialist movement. But overall, many of the lives are often told through a nationalist lens, and this book really complicates that. Sort of one of the myths or sort of the ways in which we remember many of these actors are through a nationalist lens, and this particular volume helps us rethink even more well-known lives. And of course, Nehru is a good example. He's an iconic nationalist figure in India. And he represents the Indian National Congress, which is often seen through this nationalist lens. Yet a critical engagement with Nehru's participation in the League Against Imperialism reveals that Indian anti-colonial nationalism came to be shaped by anti-imperialism, and that nationalist struggles, even in the interwar period, engaged the global as much as the national and the local. And in my particular essay, I look at how the Indian National Congress Foreign Department, well before India's independence in 1947, had thought in terms of global as well as national agendas and imperatives. And Caroline Stolte's essay also demonstrates that national objectives of figures from India, including Nehru and also others, thought about anti-imperialism anti-imperialism and internationalism, as well as global visions of things like Pan-Asianism. So breaking apart the nation is also really critical to this. Finally, and this connects with Caroline's discussion, and I'm going to turn it over to her, the lives in this book enable us to ground complex histories of global scale and trace origins, continuities, and changes over the course of the 20th century. And that kind of ties into the afterlives. So the volume unpacks the myth that the League led to Bandung, as many essays here really tackle that sort of teleology from Bandung reading back, and rather forces us to think about interwar history in its own time and provide empirical evidence of connections and disconnections with decolonization. And I think that's a really great sort of segue into what Caroline can talk about.
All right, thank you so much, Michelle. Yes, so we had this fabulous launch planned in Leiden with a full day symposium and drinks and everything. And after the disappointment of not being able to launch this book in the real world, we waited for a bit to see if the situation would change. So thank goodness for Jay, thanks to whom we are able to have this gathering today. So for those who are interested, we are organizing finally a launch on January 13th, in which the contributors of the book are going to be participating as well. So stay tuned for that too. But now the afterlives. We were deliberate in carrying the story we wanted to tell beyond the Second World War, and more importantly, beyond the attainment of political independence, for which the original participants in the Brussels Congress had been fighting. So for those who are less familiar with the story, Sukarno of Indonesia famously referred to the Brussels Congress at which the League Against Imperialism was founded in his opening speech at Bandung, which is always cited, including in this volume, as proof that the League Against Imperialism continued to be a reference point in the Third World Project. So I'll just repeat the quote here. So at Bandung, he said, "Only a few decades ago, it was frequently necessary to travel to other countries and even to other continents before the spokespersons of our people could confer. I recall in this connection the conference of the League Against Imperialism, which was held in Brussels almost 30 years ago. At that conference, many distinguished delegates who are present here today met each other and found new strength in their fight for independence." So among the people in the audience that day in 1955, that was especially true for Nehru and Mohammed Hatta, but not exclusively so. But we wanted to try and build the post-war afterlives of the League Against Imperialism on more solid ground than Sukarno's speech, however famous it was. So that's why the closing chapters of the book offer some exploratory avenues, so to speak, for building those afterlives. Historiographically speaking, I think it's safe to say that we're currently in the midst of completely rethinking Afro-Asianism as a movement, right? All its constituent parts are being deconstructed, examined, put back together as a movement that wasn't just about diplomacy or even just about social and political movements, but about individuals, about journeys, ideas, intimacies, actions. And I'm not a fan of overusing the word era, so I'll be content to say we wanted to examine the afterlives of the League during the Afro-Asian moment, right? Even if that moment was a few decades long. So in order to honor the fact that the League Against Imperialism and indeed interwar internationalism itself were politically and ideologically diverse and included much more than just the future presidents and prime ministers of states in waiting, we didn't want to close the story of the League by narrowing it down to the nationalists that succeeded, so to speak. So instead, we have 3 chapters exploring the afterlives from 3 different angles. So first, there's a chapter by Chris Lee, the Leninist moment in South Africa. And Chris will be able to explain this so much better than I can. But Chris, I'm just going to paraphrase you here. It's about the life of writer and activist Alex Laguma, right? So focusing on Laguma's book, A Soviet Journey, Chris Lee shows the longevity of the ideas espoused at the 1927 conference. And there are several layers to the story, but just to, spoiler alert, note a very direct link. Alex Laguma's father attended the Brussels conference as a delegate of the Communist Party of South Africa. And we see the League heavily influencing the Laguma household. We also see how the League was part of cementing a coherent strategy in South Africa for the Comintern, auguring in sort of these longer term tactics. So rather than emphasizing institutions or political parties, what Chris does is sort of stress the importance of individuals, but also how biography can be a really helpful way towards laying bare these global diachronic trends. So next, there's my chapter called Towards Afro-Asianism, question mark. So rather than people, I examine rhetoric. What ideas, what narratives were used to create a discursive regional unity at the Brussels conference and then later at meetings like it. So how were particular images of shared histories, civilizational units, but also lived experiences employed for that purpose? Who did it include? Who did it exclude? So from the moment the League Against Imperialism was founded, the cartography behind the regionalist rhetoric of anti-imperialist internationalism was really a shifting one. So the anti-imperialist regionalism of the League was meant to expand along with the decolonizing world. And in this sense, I conclude that the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Conference in Cairo in 1957, 30 years after Brussels, was actually the closest approximation really of a spiritual successor, so to speak, to the Brussels conference, in terms of people, in terms of the types of movement represented, but also in how that same rhetoric was used, albeit adapted then to a Cold War context. And then rounding out our section on afterlives is Jeff Byrne, who looks at how the concerns of post-colonial internationalism were institutionalized. So by looking at the stretch from Bandung to the Tricontinental in Havana, which expanded this geography of anti-imperialism even further, he shows how international institution building was an essential facet of the continued struggle against the imperial order on a global scale, and how the League Against Imperialism sort of functioned as a blueprint for that same institution building. So that's kind of a tripartite approach to thinking about these longer terms trends that were set in motion by the League Against Imperialism. Roughly speaking, biography, ideas, and institution building. So we believe that there are many more stories to tell far beyond the confines of this volume. But with this section, we wanted to emphasize really that this was not a history that ended with the demise of the League itself in the later interwar years. And I'll turn it back over to you there, Jay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to request Sue Lin if she can comment, or I could read whatever Sue Lin wants.
Thanks, Jay. And thank you, everyone. I'm just having a bit of a facial nerve pain issue, so if I stop speaking and Jay has to take over, that's why. So I just want to begin by congratulating the editors and the authors on what is truly a brilliant achievement. The book fills a massive gap in connecting the story of interwar internationalism with decolonization. Up to now, the League Against Imperialism, as the editors mentioned, has been a specter of which we only had patchwork knowledge. Frederick Peterson gave us a story of the League through a valuable story of the League through the Moscow archives and the Comintern. And the League was mentioned as an important and formative moment in the lives of anti-colonial nationalists, including some of the founding fathers of India and Indonesia. But we really lacked a connected story of this very important organization, which the book now gives. The League Against Imperialism was often known in the historiography of decolonization as a starting point and the backdrop, as the editors have mentioned, for instance, of the 1955 Bandung Conference. Sukarno's opening line, which Caroline has said already, was one that was uttered even though he, for one, was never at the LAI. And while it is true that the LAI provided the chance for some of the Bandung's delegates to meet for the first time, as including Nehru and Hatta, as the authors remind us, seeing the LAI as a precursor to Bandung blinds us to the specificity of this historical moment of February 1927 and the kind of imaginary that was promised there. For one, as Michael Goebel reminds us in the first chapter of the volume, this was not simply an Afro-Asian imaginary, but a tricontinental one that included Latin America, well before Cuba's official tricontinental in the 1960s, and one that connected left-leaning activists and campaigners on these continents to those in Moscow, Brussels, Berlin, Paris, and London. For another, it was aided behind the scenes by the impressive organizational machinery of the Comintern, and was driven by the promise of a united left, included communists, socialists, anti-colonialists, and trade unions. This seems to be a failed promise that continues to haunt the left to this day. The post-colonial era was and is constantly plagued by these splits and fractures in the left. Civil wars were characterized by nationalists fighting communists, by communists fighting socialists, trade unionists caught in between, wielding a powerful hand, and interventions by Moscow and the CIA to deepen these chasms. As the editors note, it was these fractures that led to the immediate breakdown of this international alliance. In Moscow, Stalin's decision to move from a united front policy towards one that pitted communists against socialists and social democrats. In Shanghai, the violent suppression and mass murder of Chinese communists by conservative elements of the Kuomintang. In Europe, the split between the Labor and Socialist International and the LAI. Just as the LAI was revitalized in London between 1929 and 1933 as the Colonial Information Bureau, this created that broad church in solidarity against war, fascism, imperialism, and capitalism. As Erez Manella reminds us in the foreword to this volume, the iniquities that the LAI was formed to resist are still with us today. But to go back to that moment and see it within the context of the interwar, the League Against Imperialism was the culmination of post-World War I organizing by well-traveled activists, students, and intellectuals who continued to witness the atrocities of colonial rule and the failure of the League of Nations to act as a representative voice of colonized people. As Michel Leroux has argued, its participants saw themselves as the real League of Nations. This was, as the editors say, the largest, most inclusive international group of its time. On the other hand, as the editors remind us, this is a world of men who reproduced the gender hierarchies of their time, but who seemed ignorant and detached from the organizational energy of women working in international female suffrage movements, peace movements, and national liberation movements of the period. After the Brussels conference, the League Against Imperialism Secretariat in Berlin, the Colonial Information Bureau in London, churned out news bulletins that connected the anti-imperialist struggle by allowing for anti-colonial nationalists to share and learn from each other, creating not only a new international imagined community, but informed communities that knew the contours of each other's struggles against imperial rule. I've been thinking about this book in contrast to Tim Harper's majestic Underground Asia, which maps individual journeys and networks of revolutionaries. What do we get in seeing this period of interwar internationalism through the prism of an organization like the LAI? One that is not quite underground, yet still subversive and threatening, to the point where they gave rise, as the editors mentioned, to large-scale surveillance mechanisms on part of colonial states. What this edited volume does is see this organization, and indeed see the interwar period and its legacies from a kaleidoscopic perspective, and to see how the LAI was experienced, for instance, by Latin American anti-imperialists who did not identify as communists, as in Michael Gobel's first chapter, by the young Algerian nationalist Missali Hadj, who made note of the opulent surroundings of that conference hall in Paris, and were adamant of charging an independent, homegrown path to anti-imperial solidarity, wary of Comintern interference, as in Donald Hassett's chapter, by leftist Arab intellectuals and activists and their tensions with a league that remained ambiguous on the question of Palestine, as in Sana Tanuri Karam's chapter, by the Chinese communists who built an extensive network of activists across the Americas, South China, and Southeast Asia, and whose grand internationalist and regional visions fueled the early history of the League, as in Anna Belagorurova's chapter, by Willy Munzenberg, who played a pivotal role in developing the LAI as an international organization against colonialism and imperialism, as in Frederick Peterson's chapter, by the British intelligence organizations which arose to restrict the movements of League members, such as the Indian nationalists and trade unionists, Supurka Saklavala, as in Daniel Brukenhout's chapter, by Lamine Senghor, the towering Senegalese activists and nationalists who moved between Black internationalist groups and the French Communist Party and was celebrated as the star of the Congress, as in David Murphy's chapter, by Muhammad Hatta, the future first vice president of Indonesia, emblematic of a generation of national elites active in Europe within a transnational political network, who traveled to the LAI in the aftermath of the failed communist revolt in 1926 in Indonesia, as in Klaas Stutz's chapter. What were the echoes and the legacies of the LAI? Disha Karnajani offers an intellectual history of the League through its pamphlets, papers, and political vocabularies. And Michelle Leroy traces the echoes of India and the League, as in the Indian nationalists, including Jawaharlal Nehru, who channeled the concerns of the Indian nationalist movement into the politics and platforms of the LAI. And conversely, the League's echo in the politics of anti-imperialism in India. Caroline has just given a fantastic overview of the afterlives of the book, of the afterlives of the League in the book, including these kind of exploratory avenues that we might look at in looking at these legacies and in thinking about the wider Afro-Asian movement. And noting that Bandung was much more than a diplomatic event, but was composed of various kind of points and actors and movements and cross-cutting networks, as in the kind of kaleidoscopic vision I've just described. So I think from these very diverse perspectives, we have perhaps a truer story of interwar internationalism, and indeed internationalism at this time, that puts various pieces together that we had not seen before. So I wondered if I might ask the editors what came out. First of all, I just want to congratulate you again on just a fantastic volume. And I just wondered about what came out of this collective effort that you didn't foresee in patching all these different pieces together from various regional perspectives, from multiple archives. And I wondered whether you had any surprises.
If I may quickly interject, thank you very much, the four editors. Thank you, Sue Lin. Thank you very much. So perhaps this is a good time for our audience to raise hands on Zoom while we give the editors the time to respond to the surprises that came up while they were working on this volume. And I'm sending instructions. I don't think any of you need instructions any longer, but I'm sending instructions anyway as to how to raise hands. And the floor is open for our editors to respond to what Sue Lin just said.
I can get started if you guys want. And so what came out of this that we didn't really foresee? I mean, I guess we should have foreseen that there were no women in our story. We were really excited about bringing together all of these contributions that talk about geographically diverse peoples and movements, but the absence of women and then our search to find women and gender as a framework of analysis was difficult. And I think that's really a space for, I think that there's some really cool works out right now on sort of women in the communist movement. And there's like the transnational commentarian lives. So there's a lot of really cool stuff that still needs to be done. And in many ways, in bringing this together, it asks a lot more questions for further research rather than, I mean, it's a starting point, I guess, is what I would say. The other thing I didn't foresee, and then I'll turn it over, is I kind of came to this, I was interviewed about my first book, Comrades Against Imperialism, and the question came up, could you write this book if it wasn't Nehru? And I think at the beginning of my own research, I probably might have said no. Nehru was an exceptional person in this story who really sort of connects to the Bandung story, it connects to the League Against Imperialism story. But through editing this book and bringing all of these contributions together, I realized that actually, yeah, and in fact, we did invite contributors to write various aspects of the story, and so that Nehru becomes not exceptional. And I love that he is emblematic in many ways of these wider global trends of anti-imperialism during the interwar period. And I think that this book is really important in reminding us of that global history of the moment as much as the people who were involved.
I can jump into a little bit about the surprises. So first of all, I was very surprised because I was already friends with Michelle when I realized that she was working on the League Against Imperialism, and then Sana was already at Northeastern when I was like, oh my gosh, we're all working. And then Caroline too, who we're already friends with. So the four of us are already friends, and realizing that we were working on this all together in different ways. But I think it was also a little bit surprising to all of us. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. We knew that there were more people working on the League, but I was surprised at how many people are doing such great work having to do with the League. And so having 15 chapters was a lot, but at the same time, it was necessary, and we still didn't get everything. So yeah, I think to me, that was one of the more surprising, positive, surprising things that came out of this.
Okay.
Yeah, if I may jump in as well and talk a little bit, maybe not the surprise, but the, in a way it is a surprise, but this idea that how much the archives have been diverse when it came to this project. I mean, we knew this going in, and that was the whole reason, as I stated earlier, for deciding that this is a volume project. This is an edited volume project in which people from different geographical regions and emphases and people who have different access to different archives can actually come together and write this book. That's the only way it can be written anyway. But it's also the excitement about seeing what everyone did with their archives that you know, a lot of us would not have had access to, would not have known that the League could show up, right? Like either personal papers in literature, in various photographs scattered in different archives, as well as in, of course, very formal institutionalized archives, such as the British Archives, for instance, or, you know, the Comintern itself, but also the, you know, the vastness of the types of archives that that this book just draws from, I think has been fascinating to me, and I think to all of us as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I have nothing to add. I just wanted to echo this point that what the book provides, I think, is sort of a really neat, the meta story of the book really is this broadening of the archive, right? Because for the longest time, and all of us have been working on the League for a while, right? And the standard narrative, the two go-tos are Ergospi, right? You have the Comintern archives for this, and you have a place very close to my home institution, right? The International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam, which has digitized, right, sort of the main proceedings of the Brussels Congress and the Frankfurt Congress in 1929, both of which are wonderful places. But what this does is really showing that, in fact, the interesting sources for the League and the wider history around the League and the organizations in its orbits are actually elsewhere. And I think that's also an important shift to note. Yeah, and a final really quick comment about gender, because this is something we've talked about a lot. So the League is not a stand-in for interwar internationalism as a whole, right? And I think one of the places where you see that the most is in this absence of women, where elsewhere in the interwar internationalist world, right, women were so very present. But if you invert that, the homosociality of the League, right, the fact that this was a very masculine space is very important. It's also very important to how the League developed and how it operated. And I do think that this analysis of the League as a homosocial space is something that kind of neatly occurs and recurs throughout the chapters, and I do feel that's also very a very worthwhile way to look at this. Yeah, those would be my only two comments.
Thank you. Can I just respond to Sana's point, especially about the edited collection? Because I do think, I mean, Kathleen and I have on this in the kind of Bandung era context, but I do think it is really important to kind of, you know, have these edited collections and these edited volumes that give us a wide variety of perspectives. And it does seem that, you know, often we have publishers that want, you know, the kind of that are turning back against edited volumes. And I just wondered, is there a way that we can, you know, just intellectually keep pushing for and keep, you know, constantly pushing for these edited volumes as a kind of real, you know, really true and really important way of writing these very networked histories of decolonization, especially in internationalism?
I think that's a really great point. Sorry, Sana, I don't know if you want to add in, but I think it's a really great point. I think that one of the things that was really important for this volume for us was that the essays spoke to one another. It was a very deliberate, and I think it took longer for this book to come out in many ways because we had discussants and we had workshops and spent a lot of time asking all of us to read each other's work and collaborate. And I know that Caroline and Sulin actually have like collaborative research projects that speak to one another in terms of decolonization and that as well. But I think it's really an argument, not only for edited volumes, but also collaboration. When Sana and I were at a conference, the WHA of New England, she asked me what my second project was going to be. And she said, "Are you going to write the League Against Imperialism book?" And I said, "I can't do that. I can't, because I know that these archives around the world would all need to be researched. And I don't have the languages or the training or even the time. It would take a lifetime to really write this global history as an individual." So it really speaks to the importance of collaboration and working together to write these international histories as well.
Yeah, and I would like to add to that the idea that I mean, this book looks a lot like, and it is the product that looks a lot like what it represents, what it is about, right? So the League was about collaboration, about people coming together, about writing together, exchanging ideas. Just like as you mentioned, Sulin, like the whole history of decolonization, more or less. I mean, not all of it, of course, we know, but a big part of it is about that type of work and collaboration. And therefore, I think if we want to think of the best ways to be able to represent that history and to write it, I think mirroring that type of work could be the best way to move forward.
Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. I think we can move to the Q&A. We have Brad Simpson, who has been patiently waiting. Brad?
Can you hear me? Great. So first of all, I want to thank the editors. This is really a spectacular volume. And I think it's also, even though gender is not as well represented among the cast of characters in the volume, I'm glad to see that this edited collection models what we should be seeing sort of in the field more generally, which is sort of real gender balance and representation among contributors and editors and everything else. And so I want to thank you all for that. My question is about the law. Now, and I'm glad there are so many great people from Ann Foster to Cindy Ewing here. I'm wondering if you guys in editing this volume had thought about the relationship, or if the contributors thought about the relationship between the League Against Imperialism and international law as part of the project of anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism in the interwar period. If we're thinking about sort of precursors and afterlives, you know, of course, that a lot of these figures had a critique of international law that was grounded in their radical politics, and that people such as Chris Dietrich argue helps to lead to the formation of what we now think of as third world international law, especially with regards to oil and everything else, and the formation of the UN. Did you guys have a conception, or do any of the authors who want to comment have a conception of a League Against Imperialism, Critique of International Law, and of internationalism and sort of international solidarity as one possible answer to existing international law, or as a way of prefiguring what an anti-colonial vision of international law might look like?
I can offer some very loose thoughts. Yes, that would be my short answer. Okay, so and this is particular what we talk about in the introduction for a bit. There's a real sort of a part of the raison d'être for the League Against Imperialism was also the fact that it was not the League of Nations, right? And to a very large extent, and the name League Against Imperialism was a deliberate reference to the League of Nations, right? So the emerging international legal framework that the interwar years were seeing partly inspired the fact that people felt the League Against Imperialism was necessary, right? So that emerging framework, I think, is very much and the resistance to it, part of sort of the founding story of the League. But in my work, so yeah, I'm going to represent the afterlives here, since my chapter's on the 1950s, and you see this most visibly, I think, in the continuity of League themes that you see in things like the Afro-Asian Jurists Conference in Damascus in 1957, right? So there you have people whose activist genealogies, right? Their intellectual reference points, their contacts also in anti-imperial movements have these many direct links to the LAI, and they get together and sit there, gather in Damascus to really call into question at a very critical juncture in the building of the post-war age to discuss the universality or the potential universality of legal norms, right? Whether those are even possible, and how the decolonizing world might also get on the same page in pushing against some of the emergent frameworks of the post-45 period. So I know there's very exciting work being done on the Afro-Asian Jurist Conference, and it's not being done by me. There's Ansvi Schopfel, among other people. But I think that could be a really fruitful avenue for thinking about law in this way. And I'm really hoping, I think there's going to be some exciting work coming up on that.
Great. Thank you very much. We have a question in the chat, David Webster, who had to leave. So I'm going to read out the question for our panel. He says that on the League Against Imperialism and the Bandung moment, I'd wondered if Sukarno quote is especially overmentioned, and Sukarno's speech was mostly written by Molly Bonden, an Australian working for the Indonesian Foreign Ministry. Do we need to see the people behind the scenes more in this type of work?
Well, I can just sort of briefly say, I feel like most of the essays in this volume sort of tear apart the Bandung quote by Sukarno and use it sort of to begin talking about why we need to think about the League in different ways. So yes, I think in many ways this volume is addressing the overuse of that particular quote in speech at Bandung. But I think that's a great point about the speechwriter. I actually think there needs to be more of a rich sort of history of Bandung itself, as well as what we're trying to do with the League Against Imperialism. I'll just say that.
And actually, I would just add too that many of the chapters go behind the scenes in precisely this kind of way to give new information and new perspectives on how this all, I mean, I think that Michelle was right to point to Klaas Stutch's chapter on Muhammad Hatta and the taking us behind the scenes of Indonesian nationalism. A lot of times the story we think we knew about something it gets turned around by some of these chapters. So yes, I agree. Yes, we do need to know more about behind the scenes. And I think the chapters do a lot of that work.
Yeah, I think they also do a great job about showing some of the work, if not behind the scenes, but the work that has been marginalized as people who have been marginalized in the historiography, who are not necessarily behind the scenes, but who people simply don't know about. I mean, I speak on my chapter about the Levant. A lot of the Arab participants in the League are, either not known at all, or just few of them are emphasized, like Shakib Irslan, because we know of him in another context, right, rather than in the context of the League, whereas others who are participating, and often we have people referring to certain participants as representing certain regions, whereas it's actually not them representing those countries or those regions. So there's a lot of ambiguity also, and false sometimes narratives about who was there and who did the work and who actually spoke the speeches and wrote the documents and all of that. So I think the different chapters do a lot of also clarifying of the narrative that in and of itself is not there yet, let alone the behind the scenes, which again some of the chapters do.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We don't have anybody else with their raised hands, so you're encouraged to raise your hands or write on chat, and I can read those questions. But I also know that Sulin had a lot of questions. She had told me by email before the event. So Sulin, if you are willing, we can turn back to you to give some more questions to our panel as I gather questions from the participants.
Thank you. I did have a lot of questions, but I guess one of the questions was I kind of, as I was going through it, it kind of answered itself. But one was, I guess, the question of the balance. That you mentioned the kind of differences in the ways in which each chapter talks about the relationship with the role of the Comintern, and I think that this is fantastic through the volume, because we really get different attachments to the Comintern, different views of the Comintern, and and I think that we get we definitely from the previous historiography where we did get more of a Moscow perspective, we're getting a lot of pushback and tension between a lot of the participants in terms of their attachment to communism, their uneasiness with it, and you talk about the way in which different participants have give a different weight to the role of the Comintern through the volume. And I thought that was fascinating. And I wondered, I guess, about, I guess that is the story of the League. I mean, it is, and I wondered, I mentioned a lot of that in my introduction, this kind of, the role of the splits in the left. And I wondered about the role of ideology and in the League, and would it have been possible without the Comintern? Would there have been some other kind of organization that emerged, or did it need that kind of organizational machine to bring all these different participants together?
Michelle, maybe you want to take that one, since you deal with that a lot in your book.
Sure. I mean, in a lot of ways, a lot of sort of what I wrote in my book kind of addresses Frederick Peterson's sort of history of the Comintern. And in many ways, his history is a history of Comintern sources. And I think it might have been Caroline who sort of had said, in what our introduction sort of outlines, this is really an archival story from the periphery, and the bringing together of colonial archives and in conversation with international communist archives and perspectives. So it's not a history of sort of party doctrines and ideologies, as much as it's a conversation, a fluid conversation about how those ideologies can work in different contexts and from the sort of perspectives of those not in Moscow, who may have traveled to Moscow, but certainly were not there. So I feel like that sort of gets at it. And I think it was really, really important to remember that many of the people we talk about in this volume shaped the ideas of anti-imperialism, as well as would have pushed back and influenced international communism in this moment, that it's not fixed, but rather that people like Nehru, but also many of the other people in this volume were a part of this movement, participated, had agency, but also shaped the movement as much as the anti-imperialist movement shaped them, as well as communism. So,
yeah. And we realized that this was, sorry, Caroline, did you want to go?
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we realized that this was these tensions were an issue at the time, and also that they continue to be an issue in terms of how the historians represented in the volume see this. And we decided we didn't want to paper over that. We wanted to sort of make it explicit that these are still tensions that exist in the interpretations today. It's messy. It was messy then. It's still messy.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think it's also that variety is also a function of the fact that we really sought to cover as many different areas as possible, because the lives, right, in our lives and afterlives also has a double entendre, right? It's not just about people and biographies. It's also about the different lives the League had in different contexts, and the ideological emphasis it had in different places was also very dependent on kind of what local nationalist and anti-imperialist context the League landed in, right? So seen from a perspective of local anti-imperialists in India, the League looked very different from the way it did in Algeria or in Senegal, right? So the ideological political flavor of different anti-imperialist movements around the world also determined how the League was received. So yeah, in that way, yes, it's a function of sources that we use, but it's also a function of these different contexts, I think. And it's one of the things I really like about the book is that you also see how the League in its own time was viewed very different from one place to the next.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Did the other editors have to add anything? Am I interrupting anyone?
I was just going to add, though, but it does also bring up, I mean, there's this tension within our story, but there is, I mean, we cannot underestimate the inspiration and importance of the International Communist Project, and maybe even the Soviet Union, symbolically speaking, to many anti-colonial activists who were not necessarily communists. I think that that's really coming out in a lot of not only this book, but also a lot of the current literature on international communism in the interwar period, is that even for someone who may not, like Nehru, who wouldn't necessarily be examined in terms of his relationship to communism, to reevaluate how inspirational and how important that was. And so were the funds. I mean, particularly when you look at the later years of the League, the funding from the Communist International makes it really important. It doesn't dominate in the way that, you know, or at least a lot of us should push back on it dominating, but it certainly does matter too.
Yeah, and I would like to add to that also the idea that I think what this volume does is show how, you know, traditionally we talk about the Comintern as this organization that more or less sought to have more control, to have influence, especially in the colonized world, right? I think what this volume does is it shows that local actors, historical actors themselves found opportunities within the Comintern. So kind of, I don't like the word used, but they kind of used the Comintern and certain, you know, opportunities that the Comintern created, whether it was the League or other opportunities as well, to kind of, you know, make their voices heard. So if it is through the Comintern, yeah, sure, why not? We'll do it, as long as it provides a, you know, a global stage through which we can talk about our issues where no one's listening to them, right? So I think this reversal in perspective as well, that not only gives agency to these individuals, but also shows, their different options that were available and how they use these different options to make their voices heard. And I think this story is part of that as well.
Thank you. Can I just add one more thing, Jay? I know there's another question, but I kind of, I thought this was all just so wonderful, but I wondered, there is one line, and maybe it is, I'm not sure, but there is one line where you talk about the fact that this is writing history from the periphery. And I did feel a bit uncomfortable with that term, because I do think, actually these are not peripheries at all. These are histories. So, these are distinct national, these are written from distinct national and regional histories as well. And, if we are serious about this task of, provincializing Europe, provincializing Moscow, and thinking about writing history from the perspective of the global South, do we need to just abandon that language altogether and just really, I know you complicate the term, and because you talk about, that we can't write the history of the international without a distinct understanding of the national. But I wondered about, why we even have to use that term, the periphery.
No, that's a great point. Michelle, sorry.
I was going to say, in terms of writing against the institutional history of the League Against Imperialism specifically, the center of the organizational history is in Berlin and Moscow, or at least the way it's been told. So in that way, sort of peripheralizing meant sort of getting out of Berlin and out of the Moscow sort of context, but it's a great point. You're right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that was the intention, but it was, but perhaps the language needs to be abandoned.
Okay, I hope I'm not interrupting our panel as I give the floor for a few minutes to Ares Manella, who could make it, and he has written a preface, and I've requested him to say a few words because I know he has been part of this endeavor for a while and absolutely enjoyed the process and the outcome.
Thanks, Jai. First of all, sorry for being late. And I won't take up much time because, well, I've said most of what I wanted to say about the volume in the preface, and also I see there's a couple more questions in the chat and the blue hand section. First of all, I just want to say again, I've said it before, I want to thank Heather and Michelle and Sana and Caroline for involving me in this project, from which I learned just a tremendous amount. And as I'm sure was mentioned at the beginning, where the part that I missed, one of the things that makes this edited volume so good, what's the word I'm looking for? Everything fits together. Is the fact that there was the different chapters were workshopped. They're submitted as drafts, and then everybody had a chance to talk about them and read other people's work, and then revise the work in ways that spoke to the other chapters even more. And besides that, to begin with, I think the topic was well framed and well conceived by the editors, which made it easy for the various contributors to fit their chapters together. So to the point that was made before, and it's a point I think about a lot because I co-edited with Heather actually, a series in Global International History for Cambridge University Press, what to do with edited volumes. And we've all seen edited volumes like this one, which are absolutely terrific and really move the field forward. And we've all seen edited volumes that are not as good, and where individual chapters might be good, but they kind of run in different directions and don't really hang together well. And I think one of the answers to this question about how do we get, it's true that editors and presses don't like edited volumes. They have this conception that they don't sell, which is a bit puzzling to me, because most academic books don't sell in general, whether they're edited or not. So I think one way to get over this preconceptions of acquiring editors and others at presses is to produce edited volumes like this one that really push the field forward and really fit together and not only don't have some of the vices of edited volumes where things don't really work together, but also show some of the unique advantages of collaborative work. No one person could have written this, could have put this together, as Michelle was saying earlier. Only a collaborative project could have done it. And so I think people like myself in a position to kind of argue this, make this argument to publishers. It's part of our responsibility to try to make that, on the one hand, to try to encourage the production of edited volumes that have those advantages, that leverage the advantages of collaborative work, and on the other hand, to highlight to publishers why it's so important to support this kind of work. And I've long thought in general that the discipline of history doesn't reward or appreciate as much as it should collaborative work, for promotion purposes and career advancement purposes. It doesn't count as much as solo work, and other disciplines have figured out ways to count and give people credit for collaborative work, which is incredibly important. So I think this provides us with more ammunition. This book provides us with more ammunition vis-a-vis the publishers, and to show them, look, this is how it should be done. The only other thing that I'd like to say is that one of the big things I learned from this volume, beyond all the details, is on the one hand how closely interconnected and intersected anti-colonial activists in different parts of the world were in this period, 1920s and beyond, but also how many different frameworks and how fissured this world was. Because we in this story that this volume tells, we see people coming in who are, as people have already said, or some are communists, some are anti-communists, some are in between. Some are pan-Asianists, others are pan-Islamists, others are pan-Africanists, others have different sort of projects and conceptions. Some emphasize anti-capitalism, others, particularly the Europeans involved, others emphasize anti-imperialism, and the ways in which these various perspectives refract, I think, not only help us to understand this period of the 20s and 30s, but also really throw new light on the Bandung moment and beyond, on anti-colonialism in the 50s and 60s and post-colonialism and beyond that. So I think this is a really important volume for the study of transnational anti-colonialism more generally throughout the 20th century, not just in this particular period. I'll stop there.
Can I just add, thank you so much, Erez. It was also such a pleasure to work with you and Susan and Antoinette and Ani during this, but nobody has mentioned it yet in terms of teaching with the book. And I would like to say that I'm just finishing teaching a class, an upper division class, undergraduate, on the history of imperialism and colonialism. And I had to pack a lot of stuff in because it starts in the 16th century, but I did assign the introduction to this volume because I wanted something on the League and something that deals with internationalism. And it was such a big hit with the students. They were like, coming to class the next day on Zoom, of course, they were like, why have we not heard about the League Against Imperialism? And now I am totally in love with the interwar period. So, I mean, it does work. And then I had them go to the digitized, the archives that are at ISH and do a little bit of work that way. So it really, I think, I want to use it more, but it did go over well with undergrads.
I should probably say that I have two daughters, twins, who are now going, who are freshmen, first years at Northeastern, which is Heather's university, and I keep trying to tell them, you must take a class with Heather before you graduate. Hopefully they'll do that.
I'm also seeing Brad Simpson saying that he will be assigning it in the spring, and I'm getting back to teaching in the fall. I'll be using in my South Asia class. They have to read the introduction. We have a question from Eric Beverly, and this probably would be the last question about imaginations of post-imperial futures through the LAI, and if perhaps the editors would like to comment on that. It's in the chat, but broadly defined, it's our different imaginations of post-imperial futures during the interwar period is really his question.
Wonderful. Well, did anyone want to? Okay.
You,
just
Caroline, that's you.
I feel like this is yours.
Just briefly then. No, because I cover some of the folks in my essay who were not nationalist first, and I think that distinction kind of matters because so the question in the chat, as I read it, was was the nation state a foregone conclusion, right? Was this the form in which people were thinking? And if you look at people like MPT Acharya, who is an anarchist, and Ole Birk Lorsen is here in the audience, who can tell us way more about him, or somebody who was in the orbit of the League, like Mahendra Pratap, who were all sorts of things, but it would really be very hard to narrow them down to kind of pin them down as nationalists. And one of the distinctions I think we might make is those who had radically different visions of a post-imperial world than the nationalists who gathered in Brussels, right? I mean, there were not just pan-Asianists and pan-Islamists, but also world federationalists, people who rejected the nation state altogether. And there were a lot among those who really worked very well with the nationalists, especially in the late 1920s. And I think that is key, right? So this is a moment in the interwar years, right, and sort of this openness of the 1920s, in which it was quite possible to sit around the table with like a hardline nationalist and a pan-Asianist who is quite happy, who are quite happy to work alongside each other, where the pan-Asianist will sort of understand that national independence might be a step towards later federationalism or a super state, or a nationalist participating in a pan-Asianist product who is quite happy to sort of see autonomy emerge as a byproduct of Asian federation, right? So these are not exclusive categories at the time. And that's also why I wouldn't say that the nation state is sort of the foregone conclusion in Brussels.
I would also add that Michael Grubel's essay on Latin American participants is really crucial to this, because the sort of argument is that the sort of capitalists from Latin America were operating with quite a different agenda, and that it made it actually quite difficult for Latin America to be completely included in the anti-imperialist movement until sort of the era of decolonization. So I think his chapter also speaks a lot to different agendas outside of nationalism.
Okay, we have reached the end of our time, but we still have some time for the editors to make final, final words, last words before we wrap up. And I would like to thank all of you for joining us. I mean, this is a wonderful panel and a terrific way to start the decolonization events this December. I am so grateful to the panelists. I'm so grateful to the participants. This could have not been any better than it is. So final words, the panelists, before we conclude.
I guess I would just say again something about collaboration. This process was terrific for me, just being able to work with Sana and Michelle and Caroline. It went, and then when we got a chance to work with Erez and Susan, and all all of the rest of the contributors, it was a lot of moving parts and it took a while, but it actually went amazingly smoothly. And I think we can say that now that it's actually in print. I think that it might be one of the highlights of my academic career in terms of collaboration. So.
Yeah, I can only agree. We had so many contributors who were just absolutely amazing. And for those of us who have edited too many things, right, we know how hard the process can be and how hard it can be to sort of point everybody in the same direction. And this actually was really easy. So going back to what Celine asked in the beginning, were there any surprises? Well, to me, this in a way was one, right? Also how easy it was to get the different chapters to speak to each other and to see all these different characters that one person was writing about sort of appear across other chapters without us even having to prompt authors to look for it. So in that sense, it was also a really organic process, and that was amazing.
Yes, and if you're interested in more, I have nothing to add. I agree with what was said, but if you're interested in more about this, especially hearing from our contributors, make it to our book launch, January 13. Invitations will be out, of course, soon.
I just want to thank everyone for coming. I echo what's already been said, and certainly I think it's great to hear from the editors, but the contributors are all phenomenal in this book, and a lot of them will be speaking in some way, shape, or form at our book launch. So also check it out.
Okay, great, wonderful. Thank you everyone for this enthralling conversation. I have something in the chat that tells you about the next book talk, which is on Wednesday. It's Cold Wars by Lawrence Luty. And then one more next week, which is Andy Rotter's new book, Empires of the Senses, on India and the Philippines. Please join me in thanking our panelists. We can use the reaction, perhaps here, and physical applause as well. Thank you very much. And I wish you all a wonderful rest of Monday and rest of the week. Thank you very much. Bye and take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.